It was supposed to be a peaceful morning, the kind where the sun rose slow over my fields, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. The kind where the only sound was the wind rustling through the tall grass and the gentle hum of my brand new wind turbine. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching it spin, feeling a deep sense of pride. That turbine wasn't just some piece of metal and fiberglass. It was freedom, energy independence, a way to stick it to the rising costs of, electricity. But peace doesn't last long when you've got an HOA sniffing around. I spotted the car before it even turned up my gravel driveway. A sleek black sedan, way too polished for these dirt roads, kicking up dust as it rolled in like it owned the place. My gut told me exactly who it was before I even saw the badge on the door. Hillside Community Homeowners Association. I wasn't part of their community, never had been. My farm had been in my family for 3 generations, long before that fancy neighborhood of cookie-cutter houses popped up a mile down the road. I didn't pay their dues, didn't follow their rules, and sure as hell didn't ask for their opinions on my property. And yet, here they were. The car door swung open, and out stepped a woman in a crisp navy blue suit, the kind that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust in its life. She was tall, thin, and had the kind of sharp, pointed features that made you think she'd perfected the art of looking down on people. She gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Mr. Lawson, good morning." I set my coffee down slow, already feeling the tension coil in my chest. "Can I help you?" She glanced up at my turbine, her nose wrinkling like she'd smelled something bad. "I'm Linda Harper. I'm the president of the Hillside Community HOA. We received several complaints about..." She gestured vaguely. "This." I let out a short laugh. "Complaints? From who? Cows don't make phone calls." Her smile didn't waver, but there was steel underneath it. "Your property may not be within the HOA's residential zone, but it is within the community jurisdiction. We have regulations regarding structures that affect the overall aesthetics of the area." I crossed my arms. And, she continued smoothly, "your wind turbine is a direct violation of our height restrictions and energy ordinances. It needs to come down immediately." I stared at her for a long second, making sure I'd heard her right. Then, just to be sure, I said, "Lady, I don't live in your neighborhood." Her smile got tighter. "As I said, your property is visible from our community, and we take great care in maintaining a certain standard. I'm sure you understand." Oh, I understood plenty. I took a step forward, my boots crunching against the gravel. "Let me make this real simple for you, Ms. Harper. This is my land, not yours, not the HOA's, mine. And that turbine, it's staying." Her eyes flickered with something. Annoyance, maybe, but she didn't drop that fake politeness. Instead, she pulled a neatly folded paper from her leather folder and handed it to me. "This is a formal notice. You have 7 days to comply, or we will be forced to take legal action." I didn't take the paper, just looked at it, then back at her. "You do that," I said, turning back toward my house. She stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to change my mind. When I didn't, she let out a quiet huff and turned on her heel, heading back to her car. I watched as she drove off, that same dust cloud trailing behind her. Then I picked up my coffee, took a slow sip, and looked back at my wind turbine. Then, thought they could bully me into tearing it down? They had no idea who they were messing with. The letter sat on my kitchen table, untouched. The words "formal notice" and "legal action" were stamped across the top in bold, threatening letters. But I wasn't the kind of man who scared easy. I had seen real problems in my life. Droughts that nearly wiped out my crops. A barn fire that took me months to rebuild. A heart attack scare a few years back that made me appreciate every sunrise a little more. This was just a bunch of entitled busybodies trying to push around a man who didn't fit into their cookie-cutter world. And I wasn't about to let that happen. By the next morning, word had already started spreading. My nearest neighbor, an old friend named Hank, called me before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. "You hear about the HOA nonsense?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel over the phone. "I am the HOA nonsense," I muttered. Hank let out a dry chuckle. "Figured. Bunch of them were griping about your wind turbine at the last meeting. Said it was unsightly and a blight on the community." I snorted. "It's a damn wind turbine, not a neon billboard." Well, Linda Harper and her pack of vultures aren't gonna back down easy. You know how they are. Get a little power, think they run the world. I knew exactly the type. People who thought rules were meant to control, not protect. Who thrived on making life miserable for anyone who didn't fall in line. "They can send all the letters they want," I said. "That turbine's not going anywhere." Hank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Might want to be careful. These people play dirty." I didn't take Hank's warning lightly. The HOA had a reputation for being ruthless. I had heard stories. People being fined into submission, harassed with endless paperwork, even homeowners losing their properties over ridiculous violations. But I wasn't a homeowner under their jurisdiction. I was a landowner, and that made all the difference, or so I thought. The real trouble started 3 days later. I was out in the field, mending a fence post, when I spotted the truck pulling up to my property line, a county inspector. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and walked over as the man stepped out, clipboard in hand. He was younger, maybe mid-30s, with the look of someone who didn't much enjoy being the bearer of bad news. "Mr. Lawson." "That's me," he sighed, glancing at the papers in his hand. "I hate to be the guy delivering this, but we received a complaint about an unpermitted energy structure on your property." I felt my jaw tighten. "Unpermitted? This is private land." The inspector shifted uncomfortably. "Technically, yes, but there's a municipal code requiring wind energy installations to be registered and approved by the county if they're within a certain distance of a residential zone." I let out a slow breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "And let me guess, this complaint came from the HOA?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Seems likely." I crossed my arms. "So, what now?" "Well, I'm required to conduct an inspection. If you don't have the right permits, you could be facing a fine, or worse, a forced removal order." I could feel the frustration rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the inspector's fault. He was just doing his job. "Fine," I said. "Do your inspection." He nodded and made his way towards the turbine, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes as he circled it. I watched, my fists clenched at my sides. This wasn't just about permits. This was the HOA finding a loophole, using the county as their attack dog to do their dirty work. By the time the inspector finished, he walked back over, looking apologetic. "Look, Mr. Lawson," he said, lowering his voice. "I'll be honest with you. This is a gray area. You technically should have filed some paperwork, but out here, most folks don't bother. The only reason this is even an issue is because someone's pushing for it." I exhaled sharply. "And what's that mean for me?" "It means you'll need to submit an application for approval. It could take weeks, maybe months, and until it's approved, they could hit you with fines." I narrowed my eyes. "How much?" "Could be a few hundred, could be a few thousand." I clenched my jaw. This was exactly what the HOA wanted, to bleed me dry until I had no choice but to comply. "Appreciate you being straight with me," I said, shaking his hand. He nodded, then climbed back into his truck and drove off, leaving a trail of dust behind. I stood there for a long time, staring at that damn turbine. Linda Harper thought she could drown me in paperwork, thought she could nickel and dime me into submission. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The first fine arrived in the mail a week later, a crisp white envelope, official looking, with the county seal stamped in the corner. I tore it open. Right there at the mailbox, already knowing what I'd find inside. $500 due immediately for failure to obtain proper permitting for an energy structure within a regulated residential zone. I let out a bitter laugh. This wasn't about permits. This wasn't about regulations. This was about control. Linda Harper and her HOA cronies couldn't touch me directly, so they were using every trick in the book to make my life hell. And this, fine, it was just the beginning. By the end of the month, I had 3 more, each one more aggressive than the last. The fines doubled, then tripled. The letters shifted from polite legalese to outright threats. Failure to comply may result in a lien against your property. A lien. They were trying to come for my land. That was when I knew this wasn't just some petty harassment. This was war. Spent the next few nights digging, not just through the permits and regulations, but through everything I could find on the Hillside Community HOA. Their bylaws, their leadership, their financial records, anything and everything that might tell me what kind of people I was up against. And sure enough, I found something, or rather someone. His name was Bradley Simmons, real estate developer, major investor in Hillside Community's expansion projects, and, as it turned out, a close business associate of none other than Linda Harper. I kept digging. Turns out, Hillside Community had been pushing for new land acquisitions for over a year now. Their goal? Expand their jurisdiction, absorb more properties into their HOA, boost home values. And my land? Smack dab in the middle of their little vision for the future. That was their end game. They wanted me gone. Not because of the wind turbine, not because of some ridiculous aesthetic concern, but because my farm was standing in the way of their profits. The next morning, I drove straight into town, walked right into the county office, past the bored-looking receptionist, and straight to the permits desk. I need to speak to someone about an appeal, I said. The clerk barely looked up. What kind of appeal? I slapped the stack of fines on the counter. The kind where I prove the HOA is using the county to push me off my own damn land. That got her attention. She glanced at the papers, then sighed. You'll need to talk to Mr. Rollins. Down the hall, 3rd door on the right. I didn't wait for an invitation. Mr. Rollins turned out to be an older man, mid-60s, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He looked up as I walked in, took one look at the papers in my hand, and let out a groan. Let me guess, he said. Hillside HOA. I raised an eyebrow. That obvious? He gestured for me to sit. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. That got my attention. They've done this before? Rollins leaned back in his chair. More times than I can count. They find loopholes, use technicalities, and push people until they either comply or sell. And once they get the land, they slap new restrictions on it and fold it into their HOA. I clenched my jaw. And the county just lets them get away with it. He sighed. I don't have proof. And even if I did, those HOA lawyers are real good at making sure everything looks clean on paper. I leaned forward. What if I got you proof? Rollins studied me for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. If you can prove they're targeting you for a land grab, that's a whole different ballgame. I stood up, shaking his hand. Then I'll get you proof. By the time I got back home, the war had already escalated. My mailbox was gone. Not knocked over, not damaged, gone. As if someone had ripped it straight out of the ground. And that wasn't all. My fence, the one I'd just repaired last week, had been mysteriously cut in 3 different places. My cattle had wandered out, forcing me to spend half the afternoon rounding them up. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. The HOA wasn't just trying to bury me in legal trouble anymore. They were getting desperate, which meant I was getting close to something they didn't want me to find. And that only made me more determined. They wanted to play dirty. Fine. They were about to find out just how much fight I had left in me. The night was quiet. Too quiet. I sat on my porch, rocking slowly in my chair, a rifle resting across my lap. Not because I planned on using it, yet, but because I wanted whoever was out there watching me to know that I was watching right back. I had no proof, no security cameras, no eyewitnesses. But I didn't need them. I knew exactly who had ripped out my mailbox and cut my fence. And I knew why. The HOA was scared. They thought they could push me around. But when that didn't work, they escalated. First, the fines. Then, the county. Now, intimidation. But if they thought a little petty vandalism was enough to scare me off my own land, they were about to be sorely disappointed. I tapped my fingers against the wood of the rifle stock, thinking, Linda Harper and her crew were trying to force my hand, trying to get me to fold. That meant I was close, real close. And if they wanted a fight, I was ready to bring it straight to their doorstep. The next morning, I drove straight to town. Not to the county office. Not to the police station. I went to see Jimmy Carter. Not the former president, the private investigator. Jimmy had been a cop for 20 years before he retired and started working on his own. He had a reputation for digging up dirt on people who thought they were too powerful to touch. And if anyone could find out just how deep this HOA corruption went, it was him. Jimmy was waiting for me at the old diner on Main Street, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as I slid into the booth across from him. "Heard you're causing a ruckus," he said, smirking. I grunted. "Just defending my land." He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Tell me what you need." I laid it all out for him. The letters, the fines, the vandalism, the county loopholes, and, most importantly, the land grab. When I finished, Jimmy leaned back, rubbing his chin. "So, let me get this straight. They're pushing you out, using the county to do their dirty work, and you think there's a bigger play happening behind the scenes?" I nodded. "I don't think. I know." Jimmy let out a low whistle. "All right, I'll see what I can dig up. But if you're right, these people aren't gonna like what happens next." "That makes two of us," I muttered. 2 days later, Jimmy called me. "You're not gonna believe what I found," he said. His voice had that excited edge, the kind he got when he uncovered something big. "Try me." I looked into Bradley Simmons, the real estate guy tied to Linda Harper. Turns out he's been in talks with a developer, a big one. They're planning a major expansion. But here's the kicker. Your land, it's the last piece they need. I gritted my teeth. I knew it. "Oh, it gets better," Jimmy said. "I pulled property records. Linda Harper owns multiple rental homes in the Hillside community. You know what that means?" It clicked instantly. She stands to make a fortune if property values go up. Bingo, that was it. That was the proof I needed. The HOA wasn't just trying to enforce rules. They were running a racket, using legal loopholes, bullying tactics, and county officials to force out anyone who didn't fit into their profit plan. And now that I had the truth, it was time to turn the tables. That night, I filed 2 lawsuits, one against the HOA for harassment and illegal fines, and one against Linda Harper personally, for abuse of power and fraudulent real estate dealings. But I didn't stop there. Sent copies of everything Jimmy found, emails, documents, financial records, to every local news station in the state. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the battle had officially gone public. The HOA had picked a fight with the wrong. Damn farmer, and they were about to pay the price. Linda Harper must have woken up that morning feeling real good about herself. Maybe she had her usual cup of overpriced coffee. Maybe she put on one of those power suits that made her feel important. Maybe she even smiled at herself in the mirror. But that smile didn't last long, because by 8 a.m., my story was everywhere. Local news stations, social media, even a few big-name journalists had picked it up. Small-town farmer fights back against corrupt HOA land grab. Homeowners Association accused of illegal fines and intimidation tactics. Secret real estate deals. HOA president caught in shady expansion scheme. And the best part? The HOA had no clue it was coming. By noon, my phone was blowing up. First, it was reporters wanting a comment. Then, it was neighbors calling to say they'd seen me on the news. And then, just as I expected, it was Linda Harper. She didn't call. No, that would have been too polite. She showed up. Her fancy black sedan came barreling down my driveway like she owned the place. She barely waited for the dust to settle before she was out of the car, marching toward my porch, heels clicking against the gravel like gunfire. I took my sweet time getting up, sipping my coffee as she stormed over. "What the hell have you done?" she snapped, waving a stack of papers in my face. I leaned against the railing, calm as ever. "Good morning to you too, Linda." She practically shoved the papers at me. This is a lawsuit." I nodded. "Sure is." "You have no case," she shrieked. I smirked. Pretty sure the reporters would disagree. Her face turned red. "This is slander." "No," I said slowly. "This is exposing corruption." Her nostrils flared, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She had spent years controlling people with threats, fines, and legal loopholes. But now, she was the one cornered. She took a deep breath, smoothing her blouse, trying to regain her composure. "Mr. Lawson, let's be reasonable. I'm sure we can work something out." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Like what?" She hesitated. "If you drop the lawsuit, maybe we can reconsider the fines. Maybe even let the turbine stay." I let out a low whistle. "Wow, that almost sounds like blackmail." Her jaw tightened. "I'm trying to be civil." I stepped forward, just enough for her to feel the shift in power. "Linda, you and your HOA tried to bleed me dry. You used the county against me. You sent your little attack dogs to vandalize my property. And now that I have you backed into a corner, you want to be civil?" She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. "You want my terms?" I said, voice low and firm. "Here they are. Drop the fines. Withdraw every single complaint. Publicly admit you targeted me for a land grab. Then resign. Effective." Immediately, her eyes went wide. "You're insane," I smiled. "Then I'll see you in court." She stood there, shaking, fists clenched so tight her knuckles turned white. For the first time in her life, Linda Harper wasn't the one holding the power, and she hated it. She spun on her heel and stormed back to her car, slamming the door so hard the whole thing rattled. She sped off down my driveway, gravel flying. Exhaled slowly, watching her disappear. She wasn't done fighting yet, but neither was I. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers and officials, but with neighbors, reporters, and half the town. Word had spread fast, faster than even I expected. People weren't just here for me. They were here because they had their own stories about the HOA, unfair fines, harassment, bullying. Turns out, I wasn't the only one they had tried to steamroll. And now, all those people, they wanted to see justice served. I sat at my table, cool and collected, while Linda Harper sat across from me looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, but her face was pale, stiff, her jaw clenched so tight it looked like she might snap a tooth. She knew she had lost before the judge even walked in. The case itself was open and shut. Jimmy's investigation had uncovered everything. The secret land deals, the financial connections between Linda and the developers, the emails where she outright admitted to using HOA rules to push out homeowners. And once it was all laid out in front of the judge, she didn't stand a chance. The court ruled in my favor. The fines dropped, the forced removal of my wind turbine thrown out, and the best part? Linda Harper was removed from the HOA presidency. But it didn't stop there. Because now that the floodgates were open, other homeowners started coming forward. Lawsuit after lawsuit followed. People who had been too scared to fight back before were now banding together. They weren't just going after Linda. They were going after the entire HOA, and within 6 months, the hillside community. HOA was completely dismantled. I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, my wind turbine spinning peacefully against the fading light. It had been a long, hard fight, but I had won. Not just for myself, but for every homeowner, every farmer, every person who had ever been bullied by power-hungry, self-important bureaucrats who thought they could control what didn't belong to them. The HOA had underestimated me. They thought I was just some old farmer with no fight left in him. They thought they could push me off my own land. They thought, wrong. And now I could enjoy my peace again. And this time, nobody was going to take it from me.